I really think we have a momentum going. I think there's a lot of things happening. It's important to emphasize that change doesn't come from above, it comes from below. It comes from us demanding change from the politicians and pushing them in front of us.
The United States is actually more interested in a more volatile region. There is a famous quote by Henry Kissinger: for every tank that the US gives to Israel for free, Israel's neighbors buy 4 tanks from the United States. But $3 billion were a lot of money when the US started to give aid to Israel in 1973. Today, $3 billion is not so much money as compared to the past, and Israel will not collapse if it loses these $3 billion a year in weapons from the United States. But the political aid that the United States gives Israel is extremely powerful and significant. And we could see that, for example, with Israel being accepted into the OECD, despite many objections by the member states of the OECD, but the United States pushed Israel into the organization very forcefully. The United States protects Israel now from condemnations in the UN regarding the attack on the flotilla and so on. So the political aid from the US is the main problem. And I would add to that this problem is compounded because in Europe there is just no political will to take a strategic position that doesn't comply with the US. Even though the interests, the economic interests of the European Union are not the same as the US, they're just not willing to take their own position.
How do we make Israel such a big burden on the US so that it stops its political and economic support? That's the first one. The second one is you spoke about the Arab world's BDS in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Isn't it in the BDS right now, in the BDS interest, to try to reinstate that BDS movement or the BDS from the Arab world?
The way to make Israel a burden on the US is to keep the pressure on Israel to comply with international law. I think part of the reason that the US is so worried about this pressure on Israel is that that the International Court in The Hague will next move on to try American soldiers for what they're doing in Iraq, for example, in Afghanistan. So the pressure on Israel is not just for those who like Palestinians and care about Palestinians. It's for people who are interested in making the world a more peaceful place and a more democratic place. And I think that is already starting to happen. You can hear the voices in the United States of people who are worried that too much support for Israel is undermining the US position in the world, and there's a limit to what they're willing to sacrifice on Israel's behalf. And as for your second point, I think the Arab boycott on Israel was not BDS. It was just boycott, and it was something that was only supported by states, organized by states, not so much by civil society organizations. I think that it will definitely be useful if Arab states reinstate their call not to trade with Israel. But since the biggest trading partner of Israel is Europe, we want to get the BDS as widespread as possible in the countries that Israel has more trade with. So that's even more important. But of course, the Arab boycott is very important as well.
The Arab world has a lot of inhabitants, and there is a huge economy for companies in the Arab world. So if I don't really see how you see it as less effective compared to the EU. If let's say states would boycott Israel and boycott every company, or prevent any company that invests in Israel to invest in the Arab world, I think that wouldn't that have a very huge impact, and wouldn't be on the same level as the EU trade with Israel?
Well, if we're talking about direct trade, then the Arab world has less direct trade with Israel than Europe, by far. It's a very big difference, with perhaps the exception of the Palestinian Authority, which is the Arab country. It's not a sovereign country, which is actually a very big trading partner with Israel. But it is unable to impose boycotts because it has no other sources and no contact with the outside world that doesn't go through Israel. Now, the secondary boycott which I think you referred to, which is countries boycotting, or states boycotting companies that invest in Israel in order to put pressure indirectly on the economy, is a very important tool as well. And I think one of the places that we're trying to achieve that is with the French company Alstom. Michael mentioned Veolia, the French company that's building the illegal tramway in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem. Alstom is working on the same project with Veolia, and Alstom is now trying to get a contract from Saudi Arabia to build a trainway between Mecca and Medina, which is a much bigger project than East Jerusalem, a multi-billion-dollar project. And there is pressure on Saudi Arabia to disqualify Alstom, and I can hope very much that it will.
Isn't another factor that contributes to why the EU and the US are so much more important to focus on than the Arab world the reason that Israel identifies with the European culture, that they feel that the call for BDS is coming from their own friends?
The most important aspect of boycott is the psychological impact. And when Israelis feel that they are being watched by the international community, that they are being made accountable, then of course it has a very important impact. And it is true that in Israeli society the Arab world is marginalized and ignored, or most Israeli newspapers portray the Arab countries as our enemies. I think that's a wall that has to be broken, of course. But it is, of course, much more shocking to Israelis to hear that also their friends in Europe, in the United States, in Australia, New Zealand, and are also making a statement and taking a stand demanding the international law to be upheld and justice.
The BDS provides the correct and a very effective framework for solidarity. This July we see the fifth anniversary of the call, and I think that this movement has exploded a lot quicker than many people hoped, and I genuinely believe, and it's excited to be here in Sweden, and it convinces me even more, that we will see this movement grow even more quickly over the coming months and years.